Welcome to this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley, where I'm going to give some advice on what to do if your kids are frustrated with bushcraft skills. I'm going to give some advice on quiet places to camp and forage in the UK. I'm going to talk about some firelighting and fire leave no trace advice, and also what do I think of preppers, plus some bushcraft book recommendations. Welcome to this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. Now this is a somewhat special episode. I'm in the woods as usual, but I'm in the woods in Canada. I'm in the boreal forest in Manitoba. I'm on a canoe trip. That's why there hasn't been an episode for a few weeks, because I've been in Canada. So I'm doing this canoe trip on the Blood Vein in Canada. It's mainly in Manitoba. It starts in Ontario, goes across the border into Manitoba, and then down all the way to Lake Winnipeg. And before I left, I wrote down a few questions in my notebook that had been asked, that I could do an episode of Ask Paul Kirtley while I was away, so that I can put that out when I get back. So sorry if you've been missing the show over the past few weeks. This is the episode recorded in Canada, and these are questions that have been asked before I left. Now, if you've asked questions in the meantime, I will get to those in the coming weeks. I know I've got a bit of a backlog, I'm sure. There have been more since I've been away as well, so I will get to those questions, keep the questions coming in. But without further ado, we'll start with the first question. And Ryan asks, what do I think of preppers? Doesn't it leave you overly reliant upon kit? Now, that's an interesting question. Now, I'm not a prepper. I wouldn't call myself a prepper, but there is this whole prepper thing going on. There's a lot of TV shows, or some TV shows have focused on people who are preppers, and there's quite a prepping movement in America in particular, but it's not just isolated to the States. In terms of being prepared, generally prepared for adversity, prepared for unexpected occurrences, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that's the reason why you do first aid training. That's the reason why some people maybe learn martial arts. It's the reason pilots learn how to eject from a fighter pilot. Things happen, and the point, I think, is that you train in things, in skills and disciplines and procedures and checklists. You train in those things in relation to what you might come across in terms of your outdoor life and in terms of your day-to-day life, depending on your focus, depending on what you think you may need to prepare for. Look at what the risks are that you face. If you live in a hurricane area, you're going to prepare for hurricanes, or if you live in a tornado area, you're going to prepare potentially for tornadoes. If you live in an area that might flood, prepare for that. I don't think that's a bad thing, and to be honest, I think a lot of people do those things. I remember when I was a kid, I lived in North Wales, and in the winter the electricity lines would go through the woods, and in the winter the trees would sometimes come down and they would take the electricity lines out. So my parents would make sure that we had some candles, that we had a gas stove, like a camping stove, that we had food that we could keep, that we could get out, that we could leave the freezer closed, those sorts of things, so that without electricity you can carry on living in your home without too much trouble. That today might be called prepping. In the past it was just called, just having some things in the cupboard just in case. And so I think it depends really what you're calling a prepper. I do wonder about people who have bunkers and lots of assault weapons and things, because at the end of the day, particularly if you make it known that you've got those things, you're going to be a target. So I think it's a two-way street. I think you have to be careful about making yourself the repository of all the useful food and equipment down the street. And I think that paranoia that comes out of thinking that, oh my God, I need to defend my store, that kind of fuels that thinking. And so I think at one end of the spectrum it might be a little bit unhealthy, but I don't think it's unhealthy to be thinking about what risks might I face that can take me out of my day-to-day life. You know, snow in the winter. In my car in the winter I put blankets, I put a sleeping bag, I put a warm jacket, I put a Kelly kettle or a gas stove, I put food, drinks in the back of my car in case I get stuck when I'm out and about. And it doesn't have to be snowing when you leave. You can get caught in a blizzard, you can get, and even though I drive a four-wheel drive vehicle, you know, there are circumstances in which you're going to get stuck or snowbound, and it could just be other traffic on the road that's stuck. You're going to end up stuck. You're going to need to stay warm. That's just sensible precautions. So I think sensible precautions are good. I think paranoia is bad. So I think it all starts with what are the likely risks and what are the risks that are going to make a massive difference. So it might not be that likely that your house floods every year, but you might be living in a place where it can sometimes flood. Having some preparations for that isn't a bad thing. It's the same with, you know, what if the electricity goes out every other winter? Have some preparations for that. Have some fuel, have some food, have some candles and torches and spare batteries and blankets because your heating won't work potentially. All of those sorts of things, that's just sensible precautions. And it's the same when you go into the wilderness. What risks am I likely to face? What skills do I need to have? What precautions do I need to take when I'm in the wilderness? All of those things, it's the same sort of thinking. It's just about being self-reliant, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being self-reliant. And some risks are quite long tail. If you think about a distribution of risks, some you face every day: crossing the road, driving your car, getting on an aeroplane for a flight. Those are risks that we take every day, and accidents sometimes happen, whereas natural disasters happen much less frequently. We hear about them a lot in the news because we hear about an earthquake in a far-flung country, hear about a tidal wave or a forest fire. You know, those things are fed to us on the news all the time, but if you think about the people you know, how many of them have actually been in a natural disaster, it's probably fewer, because the risks are overblown to a certain extent in the media, because the media is always concentrating on things going wrong. We like negative news, the media feeds us negative news, but the likelihood of it happening to you is relatively slim, unless you live in a place where those natural occurrences are more frequent, in which case you need to prepare for them. In terms of preparing for the breakdown of civilization, well, I'm not sure what preparations you could make, because those sorts of situations are going to be completely fluid. If you look at any country where there is a breakdown in law and order, it's a complete and utter free-for-all sometimes. Other times it's not. Other times particular powers take control. Who knows what's going to happen in a particular country, let alone if multiple countries had that going on at the same time. So I think at the end of the day, you need to be fit. You need to have good basic first aid skills. You need to have good wilderness skills. You need to be able to move quickly. Those sorts of things would be quite universal in terms of having a good skill set, and they're gonna have you well prepared for anything in your life. If you're fit and you're strong and you're healthy and you've got good first aid skills, you've got good navigation skills, you can move quickly, you've got good camping equipment, I would say that is as good a preparation for any sort of fluid situation as you can have. I think having massive stashes of food gives you quite a fixed plan, and if you've got to get from A to B to C, maybe you can't do that. Maybe you have to be more flexible than that. So I'd say flexibility is a big thing to have. And if you're genuinely concerned about what's going to happen to you in your day-to-day life, I would just say stay flexible, have good general skills, be fit, be aware of your surroundings, and don't be too reliant upon equipment. Because as I say, if you spend thousands of pounds or thousands of dollars on lots of equipment, bury it in the ground. What if you can't get to that? And yes, there are different ways of dealing with that, having things stashed in different places and what have you. But I think just being flexible, if you look at any historical situation where there's been a breakdown in law and order, whether it's because of natural disasters or whether it's because of revolution or anything, people are not really able to take a lot of stuff with them. So have a few things that you might be able to take with you that are important and that are going to help you out in lots of different situations. And your classic example is soldiers on the run. Escape and evasion survival tins, escape and evasion survival equipment from the Second World War. Those are people who were thinking about having to move quickly, not be overly reliant upon equipment, and be able to get to where they can get to. You can't always get to where you want to get to. So I think a lot of the prepping people are maybe a little bit fixed in what might be possible. And particularly in North America, there's an emphasis on weapons, and maybe rightly so, because lots of people do have weapons. But that's kind of outside of my remit as an outdoors instructor. But I would say generally, just to be prepared for a situation, is have if you're trained in and experienced in difficult situations in the outdoors, if you're fit, if you're used to undergoing hardships of bad weather, sleeping rough, having to rely upon natural resources, having to rely upon what you can find as you go, if you can navigate without an app on your phone, if you've got good first aid skills, if you've got a good awareness of your own physical abilities, if you understand fatigue and dehydration and all those sorts of things, they're very universal skills. And I think if you end up in a natural disaster, if you end up in the middle of a revolution or a breakdown in society, those skills are going to stand you in good stead in any of those situations. But frankly, personally, it's not something I focus on particularly. As long as you're fit and strong and you're good in the outdoors and you're good in urban environments and you can look after yourself, I think that's good preparation. And keep a flexible mindset. Don't have too fixed a plan. And I've talked a lot about that because I'm thinking off the top of my head. I hadn't thought too much about that beforehand. But that would be what my advice would be and my thoughts. Jonathan asks, where's the best place in the UK for food, water, shelter, and where least likely to be bothered by other people and have freedom? Short answer to that is Scotland. That's your best bet in terms of going and finding a place where you're not going to see many people in any given day. The Highlands of Scotland, but of course you've got sporting activities going on up there. You've got country sports, you've got shooting and stalking and those sorts of things going on, but you're not likely to see many people, particularly once you get away from the central belt of Scotland and up into the Highlands. Also, there's plenty of places in and around England that are less well frequented. Now, clearly the national parks are popular, particularly in the summer months and school holidays. But if you go to the Lake District outside of those periods, if you go and do a hike in the Lake District in October, when the weather can still be okay, but all the kids have gone back to school, people have gone back to work, they've finished the summer holidays, the holiday season's over. I've had some great hikes in the Lake District at that time of year when you hardly see anybody. And then there are other parts of the UK that aren't tourist magnets but have really nice countryside. So up in Northumberland, in Kielder Forest, for example, there's lots of places you can go where you can walk and not see many people for days on end. I would just avoid the really obvious popular places. Find some green, relatively empty parts of the map and head there and explore. In terms of living off the land, if that's what you're talking, let's have a look at the question again. Where's the best place in the UK for food, water? I mean, foraging, there's lots of good foraging in places in the UK, but in terms of actually living off the land full time and making a journey, that's very, very difficult. You need a very specialised skill set to do that. You need to be used to be going out without food sometimes as well, and it's extremely difficult to do that over most of the UK now, simply because in places where you might want to forage. It's owned by people, where you need landowner's permission really to get the best food. Have a look at some of the other articles on my blog about foraging, finding places to go and practice your bushcraft. Links will be in the show notes on my blog, people. I've had a few criticisms recently that I don't put the links in the show notes. I do put the links in the show notes. The show notes are on my blog at paulkirtley.co.uk. If you're watching this embedded on some other website, if you're watching this embedded on YouTube, they're not going to be there. Follow the link to my blog, find the relevant episode of Ask Paul Kirtley there. Show notes, links are all there, as well as the audio version of this and a video version, all on one page. That's where you'll find the show notes, just in case there's any confusion about that. I can't put links under YouTube and under Vimeo and in other places and on my blog. It just takes too much time. So the central repository for all the information is on my blog, paulkirtley.co.uk. Find the relevant episode. It's easy to find them on there. So in terms of peace and quiet, yep, Scotland is great. You're not going to get a huge amount of foraging done in the Highlands though, particularly above the tree line, because there's not a lot there. But in terms of open hills, in terms of wind in your hair and not seeing many people, that's a great place to go. Clean water there, great camping, freedom to roam around pretty much anywhere. So depending on what's most important to you, top recommendation would be Scotland. Otherwise, seek out some other parts of the UK that are, if you really want to focus on your foraging, that are going to give you rich pickings in terms of your foraging. That would be my recommendation. Okay, next question. Sean asks, have you ever worked with any outdoor education bushcraft schools in Canada? Do you know any recommendations? Cheers. Well, Sean, I haven't worked with any bushcraft schools in Canada. That's quite a timely question. I didn't choose it specifically because I knew I was going to Canada. I actually just went through Twitter and Instagram, found the questions that were outstanding, wrote them in my notebook, came out. That happened to be about Canada from somebody in Canada. So, Sean, I haven't worked with any bushcraft schools in Canada. The main one that springs to mind is Karamat, who had Morse Kahansky working with them for many years, and that's a good school. It has a good reputation, and that's one I would look at. They're in Alberta. I'd recommend looking at them in the first instance. I know distances are an issue in Canada, but other than that, I don't actually know of any that I could recommend to you. So apologies to that. I haven't worked with them. I've worked with outfitters. I've worked with lodges and settings in particular places in Canada, but not with other bushcraft schools. There's a good opportunity, I think, there if Karamat are running the courses that they've always run, to go and have a good course with them, and of course pick up Morse Kahansky's book and have a read through that as well, because that's all very relevant to the environment that you're going to be finding yourself in, being a resident in Canada. Good question, Sean. Next question. Gavin Henry asks, how can I get my son more involved in bushcraft? He loves the woods but has no patience. That's interesting. I think kids generally have a lower attention span. I don't know how old your son is, but they tend to have a lower attention span than adults. And I know you have got into bushcraft relatively recently, or at least in the last 6 months. You've been active on Twitter, sending me messages quite a lot, Gavin. So you seem to me the type of person that once they're into something, they're really into something. You know, the questions you've been asking me, you've been going out and practicing things. I can see that you're somebody who really wants to get their teeth stuck into things. Not everybody's like that, and maybe your son isn't, and maybe you just have to more gently bring him to the fold in terms of showing him things at a pace that he's comfortable with. And if he's becoming impatient, it's perhaps, perhaps that's a family trait. Perhaps you're a little bit impatient and you want to get the skill. You seem to want to get the skills quickly. You seem to want to learn a lot quickly. That's not a bad thing. And I don't know whether that's coming out of impatience or whether that manifests itself in impatience in you. But I think you just have to go at these things at a pace that is natural to you. And maybe the pace you want your son to go at isn't the pace that he wants to go at. That might be part of the issue. I don't know. I've only got one tweet to go on, Gavin. But equally, you can be encouraging, and if he gets frustrated, then just don't force him to carry on with that. Just let him have a go at something else, or try and explain it to him in a different way so that he feels more comfortable with it. So you might have said, right, okay, this is how you do it, son, and he's tried to replicate what you've shown him, and he can't do it, and he's finding that frustrating. If you can find a different way of explaining it, or a way of breaking it down into smaller steps so that he can achieve a smaller step first, so that builds his confidence, that would be a way to do it, rather than going the whole hog and just failing because you can't make the whole hog. Again, I don't know the exact circumstances, but I would say just take it gently. Don't force him to do things if he's getting frustrated. Try and find him something else to do and then come back to it. Break it down into little steps so that he can achieve those little steps and be satisfied with that. That builds his confidence. He's not going to get frustrated with it. And then you can go from there, and then come back to things when he's ready. A friend of mine has a daughter, and they take her to the climbing wall, and she's only 5. Sometimes she's really into it and she's climbing right at the top of the wall. Other times she just wants to play with the little dollies at the bottom of the wall and pretend they're climbing. But that's the way it is with kids. You can't force them to be of a particular mindset if they don't want to be. And I think if you then put that little girl on the climbing wall and say, get up to the top like you did last time, she'd get frustrated with that. So again, I don't know the situation, but I would just say, just gently encourage, you do things, help him break it down. Don't expect too much of him. Also tell him not to expect too much of himself. Tell him that these things take a while to learn, and see if you can have a dialogue around that, rather than him getting frustrated with not achieving what he's expecting or expected to be achieving at a particular point. That's the general advice I can give you, Gavin. If you've got more specific situations, if you've got a specific skill set that you want some help with teaching him or introducing him to, drop me an email and I can try and help you with that. Okay, thanks for the question. Next question. Lost my place in my notebook. I've been writing my diary while I've been on the trip. Okay, Woodland Dweller asks on Instagram, what one book or books would you recommend people read regarding bushcraft and why? So on my blog, I would say, first off, there is a list of recommended bushcraft and survival books. They're all good books. I would recommend you have a look at that. And go over to my blog, paulkirtley.co.uk. And in the top menu bar is a tab called Resources. Click on that, you'll get a drop down. There'll be recommended bushcraft and survival books. There are some recommended foraging books, and there's some recommended tree and plant identification books, and field guides on there as well for plant and animal sign and that sort of thing. Animal tracks and sign, and trees and plants, and bushcraft and survival books. But in there, I would say, if you had to choose one book, it's a difficult one because each book has its own qualities. Many books are targeted on a particular area or a particular zone, particular temperate zone or northern forest or what have you. But I would say Mors Kahansky's book is a classic book. It was originally called Northern Bushcraft, and it was later titled Bushcraft. And that really is the first Northern Hemisphere bushcraft book that was published in recent times. I don't class, for example, Lofty Wiseman's book as a bushcraft book. It's a survival handbook, and it's a very good survival handbook, and it was one of my Bibles when I was growing up. But in terms of bushcraft books, the first Northern Hemisphere one really was Mors Kahansky's Northern Bushcraft, later renamed just Bushcraft, and that was meant to be a foil to Richard Graves' Bushcraft book, which was originally a series of pamphlets, which was later put into a single volume. He was Australian. That's an Australian book, and so Moore's book was a sort of meant to be the Northern Hemisphere equivalent of that, but it does very much focus on the Northern Forest and the Northwoods because he was based in Alberta. That was his area of expertise. But I think if you spend any time in Canada or Northern North America or Scandinavia or Northern Europe and into Eurasia, that book is a real one that's worth spending some time with, and it applies to a lot of the UK as well. Now there aren't going to be all the species in there, but the types of species, the coniferous trees in particular, the willows, the uses of those, the birches that are in that book, and his uses of them, it's all the same, it's all universal. There's a lot of detail in there. It's very, very good, and I would say if you read that book and understand the techniques in there and have practiced the techniques in there, certainly all the basic firecraft, the bindcraft, all of those things that are in that book, then that will stand you in very, very good stead anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. So that would be my number one choice there. And have a, you've got many a long dark nights reading that, and many a summer day practicing those skills, and many a winter day out in the snow practicing the winter skills in that book as well. So that's, there's a wealth of information in that book. And then have a look back at some of the older books like Kephardt's Woodcraft and Camping book. That's one that's worth looking at, and some of the old Nessmuck is always a good read as well. And then also, high up on my list, it's not one that would be, it's not a practical book in that sense. Mors Kahansky's book is a very practical book, but a more philosophical book, I would have a look at Thoreau's Walden. Again, that will give you many, many nights of reading, lots of things to think about in terms of your place in nature, our place as people in modern society. And it was written quite a long time ago, but it's still very, very relevant. So Henry David Thoreau's Walden and Mors Kahansky's Bushcraft, if you've got those in your rucksack on any trip, that will keep you more than occupied with reading and stuff to think about and practical material to work on. So those would be my top recommendations. And then have a look at some of the old Woodcraft and Camping books. Go onto Amazon and search for Woodcraft and Camping. Bring up some of the old books, Kephardt and Nessmuck and those and the likes. They're well worth having a look at too. And most of those books are recommended on my blog, as I say, at paulkirtley.co.uk. Next question from Michael. Hi Michael, good to hear from you again. Michael asks, I find it difficult to leave no trace when having a campfire on a meadow. What is your advice? Avoid this at all? Take away turf? How can I do this without a shovel? Well, that's a pertinent question, Michael, because I do see fire scars in grassy areas. It doesn't have to be in a meadow. There's plenty of places where I see vegetation damaged. The first thing I would say is, if you can, try and find a place where you are not going to damage the vegetation with a fire. If you're having a fire in a meadow, as I understand it, and I know your English is very good, but I know it's not your first language. So if you mean in the middle of a field, you're clearly going to have to bring in that fuel in from somewhere to have a fire. Maybe have a fire closer to the source of the fuel, where you can find somewhere like I am now, where I'm sitting. I'm in the middle of the woods, and a lot of it's quite low-lying, loamy soil. Some of it's quite wet. There are poplars behind me. There's jack pine over there. There's black spruce, and there's some balsam fir, and there's lots of moss around here and lichens, but there are some bare areas of rock. And if I was going to have a fire here, I would search out the bare areas of rock and have the fire there, partly because I don't want to start a forest fire. I don't want to spread fire into the root systems of the trees, but also I'm not going to damage the small vegetation that's the understory of the forest. And it's the same goes for grassy areas. Try to try to avoid that if you can. Now, if you have to have a fire in a grassy area or an area where you're going to potentially damage plants, the best thing you can do, and it is a best, it's not necessarily a no damage option, but the best thing you can do is to dig out an area of turf, and not just directly where you're going to have the fire, but also around where you're going to have the fire, so that the heat of the fire doesn't singe the material, the grass, for example, around the area. Keep the fire as small as you can. If you just need to boil something or cook, then keep it as small as you can. And ideally, you use a trowel for that. Now, on this trip that we're doing, we've got a trowel with us. It's in our toilet kit. We've got toilet paper and a cigarette lighter, an alcohol hand gel, and a small plastic trowel in a dry bag that is our toilet bag. And we use that in camp. That's the signal that somebody's gone to the toilet, gone into the woods. We agree on an area, but also we have a trowel. If we needed to dig out an area, we could use that. So a small plastic trowel is quite light. You can get some good robust ones these days, or a folding metal one is another type that people carry. People often carry those little trowels for latrine use. So that's something you could also put to use for having a fire, and that would be one recommendation. Using a digging stick is pretty difficult. You're going to damage the ground quite a lot. You could, I guess, dig around as much as you can and then tear the turf up. That's going to be quite tricky. It's possible though. It's going to be quite time consuming. If it's just a quick fire, maybe it's not worth your while doing that. But if you really do need to dig the turf out, dig around with a digging stick. By that I mean just take a stick that's a few feet long, about 1 meter long, 3 feet long, chisel the end, and then dig into the ground around the area, and then pull the turf back. Try and roll it so that you keep the moisture on the inside, set it to one side and have your fire, and then put that back afterwards, after you've made sure that you put plenty of water into the ground and made sure that the charcoal is dispersed. Now, charcoal will encourage, the nutrients from charcoal are good for some plants, and gardeners do sometimes. The red squirrel there, I don't know if you can hear it, there's a red squirrel chirping in the trees there. Some gardeners will put charcoal into their soil, particularly in heavy soils, but it doesn't always benefit all plants. So spread that around, put the turf back, and hopefully it will take root again. But as I say, it's not necessarily it will immediately leave no trace, because it'd be difficult to see that turf has been removed, or there's been a fire there. But you then need that grass to grow back again. Now, thankfully, if it's just grass we're talking about, grass is a pretty resilient family of plants. They're one of the most populous plants on the planet. There are grasses on every continent pretty much, and they grow quite prolifically where they do grow. So over time that will likely come back. But if it's a sensitive area, if it's a wildflower meadow with other species, I would try to be avoiding having a fire there unless absolutely necessary. And of course, you can get these little stoves, little honey stoves and similar these days, that pack down, where you can have a fire raised up off the ground, and that's another option. Take a piece of aluminium sheeting it's thicker than aluminium foil that you would use for cooking in the home, the sort of thing that you would use for windshields, and you can place the stove on top of that to stop any embers dropping through. But you still need to have the fire raised off the ground, because similar to those disposable barbecues, when you see people going into the park and having a disposable barbecue, they have the disposable barbecue, they light the charcoal, they cook their food, and then they take it away and they leave a scorch mark on the grass, which takes some time to recover. You don't want to be doing that. You need to have it raised up away from that, so there's a separation, there's an air gap between the actual combustion and the heat of that combustion and the vegetation underneath. So those are my pieces of advice. Avoid it if you can. Try and find a more suitable spot. If you have to, remove the turf, and if you can, have a device that allows you a small fire that separates it from the ground and doesn't damage it in the first place. Hope that helps, Michael. Right, and I think that ends this episode of Ask Paul Kirtley. So thank you very much for watching. I'm coming towards the end of this trip. I've recorded it towards the end because I wanted to make sure I had enough battery. I've been recording the proceedings of this expedition that we've been undertaking. I will turn that into a film, so keep an eye out for that. It's not going to come out immediately. These things take time. But I'm looking forward to getting back home and putting this out for you to watch. We've been The only communication we've had is satellite phone, which we haven't used the whole time that we've been out. We just carry this for emergencies. But it's been really nice to be switched off and unplugged for a couple of weeks. But I'm glad as well to be able to present this new episode of Ask Paul Kirtley to you from the fantastic northern forest, the boreal forest of Canada. Absolutely fantastic environment to be in, an absolute privilege to be travelling here and to be camping here. Lots of stories to tell from this trip, which, as I say, you'll see in a video at some point in the future. But for the meantime, I hope that episode of Ask Paul Kirtley was useful to you. Please keep asking the questions. They tax my brain. Some of them I have to scratch my head a little bit, like Ryan's question about preppers at the beginning. Hopefully that was useful. Some of the stuff is more directly what I do day to day, but I think it's useful to stretch your thinking and ask questions around what I do as well. So keep your questions coming in, keep them varied, keep them wide, keep them interesting, keep them quite short as well. Twitter and Instagram work really well. Hashtag #AskPaulKirtley. That works really well. I can find those quickly, and like I did before this trip, I just searched Twitter for Ask Paul Kirtley, find the questions, wrote them down. Same with Instagram, find the questions, wrote them down, and I can bring them with me. Even here, where I've got no connection to the outside world, I certainly don't have a smartphone or a computer. I've got a camera and a lot of batteries and a notebook, which is a really nice way to be for a few weeks, just to be in tune with nature, travel with the rhythms of nature. There's still some really cool dragonflies flying around here. It's been quite warm, and there's a few mosquitoes around, less so now. It's been cooler this week and the mosquitoes are dying back, but the dragonflies fly around eating the mosquitoes, which is absolutely fantastic to watch. It's very helpful. I need to train a fleet of dragonflies to take with me on these expeditions that I can just have flying around. I can unleash to eat all mosquitoes. But anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.